Welcome in, everyone, to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at a topic that's really changing how we all think about work, I think. And that is the gig economy.
Yeah, it's certainly something that is a hot topic right now and, lots of strong opinions all over the place.
Exactly. And to kind of get into it, we're looking at a documentary series called The Future of Work, and specifically part 4 of that series, which is titled The Gig Economy, Freedom or Fragility. So we're going to explore that question, the good, the bad, and hopefully give you some food for thought to form your own opinions as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a very complex kind of landscape, and it's not always, as simple as the headlines make it out to be.
Right. And right from the start, this documentary kind of throws out a stat that's really mind-blowing. I think 36% of workers in the U.S. are now freelancers,
Hmm.
which is just a wild number to think about. That's, over a third of the entire workforce choosing gigs over traditional jobs. So it really makes you think about how different things are from, that old idea of a job for life
Yeah.
that we used to hear about so much in the 20th century.
Yeah, and I think one of the points that the documentary makes is that this isn't just some small trend. It's really becoming a major part of the economy.
Yeah.
And, they actually pull in some data from McKinsey that says 162 million people across the U.S. and the EU are doing some kind of independent work. So that's, it's a global market that's worth $1.5 trillion.
Wow. So we're talking, huge numbers here, but one of the things I really appreciate about the documentary is that they do a good job of showing both sides of the coin. On the one hand, you have that flexibility and opportunity that draws so many people to the gig economy. But then on the other hand, there's this real sense of instability and that lack of security that comes with it.
Yeah, and to really kind of show that contrast, they bring in the stories of two very different people working in the gig economy. One is Sophia, a graphic designer who's embraced that whole digital nomad lifestyle. She's working from Bali, making double what she used to. And it really seems like she's living the dream that so many people associate with the gig economy.
It makes you wonder, like, what is it about graphic design in particular that lends itself to that kind of lifestyle? Because, not everyone can just pick up and work from a tropical island.
That's a great point. And it's something that the documentary does address. They talk about how Sophia's success comes from a combination of things.
Yeah.
You know, she has skills that are in high demand. She's good at marketing herself, and she's really organized and able to manage her time and projects effectively. And I think, those are all traits that are valuable in the gig economy, but they're also skills that would serve anyone well, even if they're in a more traditional job.
So there are definitely some lessons there for anyone kind of looking to succeed in this new world of work, whether they're full-time freelancers or not.
Absolutely. And then on the other side of the spectrum, the documentary introduces us to Diego, who's a rideshare driver in LA. And, his experience is very different. He's dealing with fares that are going down. He doesn't have any benefits. And there's this constant worry of being deactivated by the platform's algorithm. So it really highlights that precarity that so many gig workers are facing, especially those in those lower paying sectors.
Yeah, it's definitely a stark contrast to Sophia's situation. And I think to kind of help us understand these issues at a deeper level, the documentary brings in Dr. Emily Torres, who's a labor economist.
And Dr. Torres makes a really crucial point, which is that the gig economy is not a level playing field, right? It can actually amplify existing inequalities. So you have people with in-demand skills and the ability to market themselves like Sophia who can really thrive in this environment. But then you have people in those low-wage gigs where it can be a real struggle to even make ends meet, let alone get ahead.
Yeah, and the statistic that she shares is pretty shocking. 40% of gig workers are making less than minimum wage, and they have absolutely no safety net.
Yeah, that lack of a safety net is a major concern that comes up again and again in the documentary. Things like healthcare, paid time off. It just makes gig workers incredibly vulnerable, especially if they get sick or can't work for some reason.
And to kind of show this visually, the documentary uses this simple but powerful image of a graph. You have a volatile line representing the income of a gig worker compared to the steady line of a traditional salary job, and it just really kind of sticks with you.
It really highlights the uncertainty that's baked into so many of those gig economy jobs. But, even with all these challenges, the documentary also shows that there's this growing movement that's pushing back against exploitation in the gig economy.
Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, it is. And it's encouraging to see. And, the documentary kind of shifts gears at this point to focus on this fight for workers' rights. And they highlight specific efforts that are happening, like California's AB5 law and Spain's Rider law.
Okay, yeah, I've heard those terms thrown around, but
Yeah.
can you break those down for us a little bit? Like, what do those actually mean for gig workers?
Sure. Yeah. So, these laws are basically trying to reclassify gig workers as employees instead of independent contractors. And, that would give them access to all those basic labor protections and benefits that they're often missing out on in the gig economy. And AB5 is specifically aimed at doing this across a lot of industries, whereas Spain's rider law is kind of focused more on those who are working for those food delivery platforms.
So it seems like a step towards kind of leveling the playing field a little bit, but I imagine there's some resistance to those changes.
Oh, yeah, huge resistance. The documentary actually points out that companies like Uber spent a staggering $200 million to fight AB5, which
Yeah.
just shows the kind of uphill battle that gig workers are facing when they're trying to secure their rights.
Yeah, that's a lot of money and influence to go up against. So how are gig workers kind of making their voices heard in this environment?
Well, that's where organizations like Gig Workers Collective come in. And the documentary features Maria Lopez, who's one of the co-founders, and she makes this really powerful case for worker dignity and collective action.
What stood out to you about her message?
Well, she really emphasizes that the fight isn't against technology itself, right? It's about the exploitation of workers. And she points out how these platforms are making billions of dollars while the people who are actually doing the work are the ones who are shouldering the costs of things like, healthcare, vehicle maintenance, all these other expenses. And, it's really about trying to shift that balance of power.
Right, it's not about stopping progress, it's about making sure that the benefits of that progress are shared more fairly.
Exactly. And it's interesting how the documentary kind of contrasts, that traditional image of union rallies
Yeah.
with the digital activism that we're seeing with gig workers. They're using hashtags like pay up to spread awareness and organize online.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a way to connect and mobilize people across, those geographical boundaries, which is really crucial in a sector that's as dispersed as the gig economy. But what about solutions beyond protests and legislation? Are there any kind of alternative models that are starting to emerge?
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting. The documentary explores the idea of worker-owned cooperatives as a potential path to a more equitable gig economy. And they use Stocksy United, which is a stock photo co-op, as an example. And in this model, the workers are also owners. So they actually have a say in how things are run, and they share in the profits.
That's a pretty radical departure from the typical platform model. Does it actually work in practice, though?
Well, the documentary suggests that it does, and they also highlight apps like Juno, which is a ride-sharing platform that actually gives drivers equity stakes in the company. So it's all about, shifting away from that purely extractive relationship to one where workers have a real stake in the platform's success.
So instead of just being cogs in the machine, they become partners. It's like
Yeah,
the difference between renting a home and owning a home. I imagine you feel much more invested and empowered when you have that ownership.
precisely. And
Yeah.
to kind of personalize this concept, they introduce this to Aisha, who left her retail job to join a worker-owned delivery co-op. And she talks about how, she might earn a little bit less than she would with Uber, but the sense of agency and ownership that she feels makes it all worthwhile.
Yeah, her story really speaks to that idea that, people aren't always just motivated by money, right? Having a voice, feeling respected, being part of something bigger, those can be incredibly powerful motivators.
Absolutely. And I think Aisha's experience shows that, these alternative models can create a much more fulfilling and sustainable work experience.
Yeah.
But the documentary is also very clear that, scaling these models up to a larger level is going to require some pretty big systemic changes.
So what kind of changes are we talking about here?
Well, things like portable benefits, universal health care, and updated labor laws that actually, address the realities of the gig economy. It's not just about tweaking the existing system. It's about creating a whole new framework that ensures fairness and security for everyone.
So I'm curious, what are portable benefits exactly?
Yeah, so it's basically a system where your benefits, like healthcare and retirement savings, aren't tied to your employer. They're tied to you as a worker. So, as you move from gig to gig, those benefits would move with you.
Okay, that would be a huge game changer for so many gig workers who are currently juggling, multiple jobs with no safety net. Imagine that peace of mind, knowing that, your healthcare isn't dependent on staying with one particular platform or client.
Absolutely. And then with universal healthcare, you know, everyone has access to affordable quality medical care, regardless of their employment status. So it really takes the pressure off of those gig workers who are often forced to choose between, their health and their income.
It sounds like these solutions require a real shift in thinking, not just at the company level, but, at the societal level. It's about recognizing the value of all work and ensuring that everyone has a fair chance to thrive regardless of how they're earning a living.
That's exactly it. And, the documentary reminds us that the future of the gig economy isn't predetermined. It really depends on the choices that we make as individuals, as consumers, as citizens.
So it's not just about observing this trend, it's about actively shaping it. What are your thoughts on the role of technology in all of this? Because it seems like it's both, the driver of the gig economy, but also potentially a source of solutions.
It is, yeah, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. We
Uh,
see that with the algorithms that control so much of the gig economy. They can create really unfair situations for workers. But the documentary also talks about this push for algorithmic transparency, which would basically give workers more insight into how those systems actually work and potentially help them challenge unfair practices.
yeah, that sounds like a pretty crucial step because, you don't understand the rules of the game. How can you play it effectively, let alone try to change them? But I think, kind of zooming out a bit, it's worth asking, like, what does the rise of the gig economy tell us about the future of work in general?
Well, I think it's definitely a sign that that traditional 9 to 5 model is starting to, lose its dominance.
Hmm.
We're moving towards a world where work is more fluid, it's more project-based, it's more independent. And, the gig economy is just kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, it makes me think about, that idea of a portfolio career where people are kind of piecing together their income from multiple sources, some traditional, some gig based. It's like, diversifying your work life instead of just relying on one employer.
Exactly. And, this shift brings up all these new questions about how we define work, how we measure success, and how we make sure that people have the security and support they need in this new landscape.
It's exciting and kind of daunting at the same time, but I want to kind of go back to the documentary for a minute. What were some of the key takeaways for you about kind of navigating this new world of work?
I think one thing that really stood out to me was the importance of agency.
Hmm.
Even in the midst of all this precarity, gig workers do have a certain degree of control over, their schedules, the projects they take on, their skills development.
Right.
It's not always easy, but there's an element of entrepreneurship that I think a lot of people find really appealing.
Yeah, we saw that with Sophia, the graphic designer. She wasn't just waiting for someone to give her a job. She created her own opportunities. She built her skills. She marketed herself. She took risks.
And even Diego, the rideshare driver, he had more autonomy than he did in his previous jobs.
Yeah.
He could set his own hours, choose his routes, manage his time to a certain extent. And, it's not an ideal situation, but it shows that even within those constraints, there's a possibility for people to kind of take ownership of their work lives.
Yeah. And of course, with that agency comes responsibility, right? You have to be self-motivated. You have to be organized. You have to be constantly learning. But I think for a lot of people, that's part of the appeal. They're not just following orders, they're shaping their own destinies in a way.
Absolutely. And, another really crucial takeaway from the documentary was the power of collective action. Even though, the gig economy is often seen as this very individualistic thing, we saw how workers are coming together, they're banding together to advocate for better conditions, to challenge those unfair algorithms, to support each other.
Yeah, the rise of organizations like Gig Workers Collective is a real testament to that. They're proving that solidarity is not limited to those traditional workplaces. It's happening online, it's happening across geographical boundaries, and it's making a difference.
And it's not just about, demanding change, it's about creating alternatives,
Yeah.
right? The documentary showed how, those worker-owned co-ops and platforms that offer equity stakes are starting to emerge as viable options.
Yeah, those models are still relatively small, but they offer a glimpse of what a more equitable and sustainable gig economy could look like. It's about shifting from that, extractive mindset to one of partnership and shared ownership.
Exactly. And I think it all comes down to recognizing that the future of work isn't something that just happens to us. It's something that we're actively creating through the choices we make, the policies we support, the technologies we develop.
So, as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a call to action. Whether you're a gig worker, a consumer, an investor, or just someone who cares about the future of work, your actions matter.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Inform yourself, get involved, support businesses that are treating workers fairly, advocate for policies that promote a more just and equitable gig economy.
Hmm.
The future is really in our hands.
Well said. It's been a really fascinating and thought-provoking conversation, exploring this topic that's really reshaping the world around us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the gig economy.